campaigning in America. Your own Pepper Culpepper, here from the Blavatnik School, professor of politics and public policy, am I right? Yes. And Sohrab Ahmari, made sure I pronounce your name correctly, editorial page writer at the Wall Street Journal here in London. Or rather, not here in Oxford, but anyway, in Britain, here. So I'm going to start with Rasmus, because Rasmus is going to talk about the media, social media, and the campaign. And then we'll have a little history and precedents from Sarah. But we'll move on. Rasmus.
Thanks very much, Bill. I'll say a few things about the role of news media in this election and the role of social media, and then later on we'll probably return to the question of the role of the press as part of the checks and balances of American government in the current political environment. To think about the role of news media in this election, I think you have to think about what the problem of professional journalism is, which is the problem of how do you make the invisible world visible to the citizen of a modern state. So given that we live in a complex environment that is far beyond our own personal experience, how can journalism in real time try to make sense of this world in a way that empowers people to make decisions? Find truth and report it. That's the credo of American professional journalism. Now, of course, as all of you as users of journalism will realize immediately when you compare what you encounter from journalists to your own experience on things that you actually know something about, truth is tricky. It's not an easy task that journalism aspires to. Truth is difficult because we live in a complex world, and to understand that and make sense of it in real time is very challenging. Truth is difficult because the truth can be opaque, and there are areas in which the truth is contested. So in practice, even if the ambition of professional journalism in the US is to find truth and report it, very often what journalists have to fall back on, this is not because they are evil people, but because they are people trying to do a difficult job, is what we might think of as a sort of a ritual of objectivity, where the placeholder for truth becomes the well-known balance of he said, she said. So in this country, we think of this as due impartiality as a placeholder or a practically possible substitute for the search of truth in real time. Now, the challenge with this strategic ritual of objectivity, he said, she said, is that if most of the sources that you rely on in your reporting operate within a, relatively speaking, shared universe of facts and some degree of consensus on basic principles of what society is like, even if they want to change it in different ways, it kind of works on a day-to-day basis. But if some political actors decide that they don't want to be part of that consensus, rightly or wrongly from your personal point of view, I'll leave that to each of you to make up your own mind about that, that kind of reporting becomes very challenging, and the issue becomes one of what critics of the American press would call false equivalence, where in the pursuit of objectivity or balance through the he said, she said, reporters risk comparing things that the individual citizen may not think of as comparable. One candidate makes one set of statements, another candidate is careless with her emails. The other candidate makes a new set of statements. The other candidate is careless with her emails. These things become balanced in a way that may suggest this kind of false equivalence, if you will. The other problem with truth, if you will, is that truth is boring. Truth is sometimes the same as it was yesterday. Whereas news, in addition to wanting to finding truth and reporting it, also tries to make things interesting, right? And some things are newsworthy even if they aren't true. And they are very tempting for journalists. Again, not because journalists are evil, but because they are professionals trying to do their job. And if someone says something that is truly outrageous, it is very hard not to cover it. Now, the challenge then becomes, how do you cover this? And I think one of the issues that has played out in the American election for a lot of journalists is that if you take some of the statements that have been made by one of the candidates literally, they are outrageous, and they were covered as such. We should remember that Mr. Trump was not given a free run by the press. They were covered as being outrageous by many commentators and many journalists. But the trickier part, as Margaret Sullivan has rightly pointed out in a piece for the Washington Post, is one thing is what the candidate literally said, and something else is what it meant for the people who were listening. So what Mr. Trump said on some occasions may have come across as outrageous to you, as it did on many occasions to me. But what it meant to many Americans was not the literal content of the statement. What it meant was that he was genuinely different from an establishment that many people in the US are discontent with, disenchanted with, and alienated from. So those people were not necessarily listening to the literal truth of what the man said, but the meaning of it. It meant that he was different. And this, if you will, newsworthiness of those statements is what has given him this ride of publicity, this incredible visibility that he has had. Some people try to estimate the value of this, the free publicity. Even in the primary, the free PR that he was given through the coverage was estimated by some people being worth $2 billion, far more than anything spent by the campaign itself. How do you think about the relative balance between that free publicity and the fact that the press has been dogged in its very detailed, fact-based investigation into Mr. Trump's history, his personal beliefs, his professional activities? I think a way to think of it is to say basically television has been very good on the publicity, good in the sense that the newsworthiness has taken up a lot of space on cable news, but also on local television news and the network news broadcasts, and has given him a lot of visibility. Whereas newspapers have been much more detailed and fact-based in their often very critical reporting, independent but also critical because there are things to criticize, and also in critical commentary. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other newspapers too have dug into Mr. Trump's activities. In terms of the election, the situation we face is one in which that division is compounded, if you will, in its consequences by the differences in the audience of these things. Newspapers reach people who political scientists would think of as high information partisan voters. And that means, crudely put, that the careful fact-based criticism and commentary provided by American newspapers have made zero difference in the electoral outcome because it's almost exclusively been consumed by people who already had made up their minds about both candidates. Whereas television reached many more people who political scientists would call, no one would call themselves this, but political scientists would call them low information and undecided voters, who saw Mr. Trump's genuine difference, but were not necessarily confronted with the deep background reporting and commentary and criticism that was provided primarily by newspapers. That is my take on the role of news media in the election, and I want to say a few things about social media, which many of you, I think, will have encountered the arguments about the importance of social media in this election. And the first thing I want to say about that is that we don't know very much. And as a social scientist, I'm very interested in this question of what social media actually meant for this election. But I'm also very of the moral panic that rushes to a conclusion that Facebook swung the election, or social media were decisive. We have had these moral panics around all new technologies. One problem with these moral panics is that they are rarely actually true, to return to the T word. Another one is that they distract from for many people, perhaps more uncomfortable hypothesis, which is that the outcome of this political process was driven by politics rather than media, and that we cannot blame neither news media nor technology for those seeking blame for the outcome. But what do we know about social media? I think we know a few things. There are some things we don't, but there are some things we know. We know that social media are more and more important for how Americans come across news. But we also know that this is particularly so for young people. And young people did not vote for Donald Trump. Donald Trump's share amongst young people, according to the exit polls, was much, much lower than for the population as a whole. For older people who overwhelmingly voted for Trump, they relied much more on television for news and not on social media. We know that there is a problem of fake news, in lack of a more precise term, on social media, but we don't know how big this problem is. It is clearly not a good thing for democracy that 1 million people have shared a video called "The Pope Endorsed Donald Trump," because that is patently untrue. But Mark Zuckerberg says that less than 1% of the content shared on Facebook is fake. Now, 1% of a very large number may still be a lot, but we don't know, and we have no independent way right now of verifying what the truth is as to how much of the information that's shared on Facebook is, at worst, fraudulent and fake, and at best, misleading. We don't know. What we also know is that everything else being equal, those people who rely on social media for news are exposed to more diverse news sources than those who don't. This may surprise you. You will have heard the term filter bubble, this idea that social media reinforce an echo chamber where we exist in beliefs that are only sort of resonate with our own and reinforce them. The best available research in this area, as far as I can tell, would primarily suggest that insofar as people exist in these echo chambers, it is much more about social sorting, the fact that most of us primarily know other people who are like ourselves, and political polarization, that most of us mostly know people who broadly share our political views, not specifically or precisely, but in broad terms, and that social media may marginally reinforce these echo chambers, but that these echo chambers are much more fundamentally sociological and political in nature than they are technological. And what we do know is that in particular for those people who are not very interested in news, this is some of the research we're doing at the Reuters Institute, those people who are not very interested in news, in fact, social media may be reintroducing the idea of incidental exposure to news, that people who are not very interested in news actually get more news on Facebook than they would without Facebook. So personally, I'm quite skeptical of this idea that social media swung it. Personally, I think the political outcome of the election was a political outcome and a social and an economic outcome and not one driven primarily by media. But I've tried to outline some of the things I think we know about why it was difficult for the American news media to deal with Mr. Trump and very unconventional candidate, and why we shouldn't blame or give credit to social media for the outcome of the election last week.
Splendid. Well, that's great. We'll come back to what the role both the media and the social media might play during the term of the presidency over our discussion. I'll share a prediction based on the alignment in many ways psychologically between Donald Trump and Silvio Berlusconi, my old friend from Italy, which is that Silvio Berlusconi was the type of politician who wanted to reach above the heads of all conventional media, even the ones he owned himself, and led a permanent campaign. So I think I would predict that we will see the president permanently using whatever media he can, which includes social media, but also television media, to get his message across directly, including probably doing what Silvio Berlusconi used to do, which is to dial in personally into talk shows. So suddenly the White House will be on the line in that talk show. Anyway, businessmen, history,
so
presidents. Sarah.
Yes, thank you. I thought that when we were given a very open brief, we were just asked to talk about reactions to the election, but particularly perhaps not focusing on the immediate, how did this happen, which a lot of people have been addressing, and perhaps to think about what happens next. But, and there is a lot to be said about what happens next, and at first I thought I was going to talk today about what I think we have to do to shore up liberal democracy, to shore up our political system, and there is a lot to be said there. But I find myself more and more seeing a lacuna in the coverage of the way that people talk about Trump's victory. And it seems to me it's a very important part of the picture, and I say this as an American myself, although I've lived here now for 17 years. But there's been an enormous amount about identity politics. We're all talking about identity politics, and for good reason. That clearly drove a lot of what happened, but in very complex ways, not in simplistic ways. We're hearing a lot about economics, obviously, about globalization and neoliberalism. All those things are important. I think there are two things that we need to think about in relation to Trump in particular that I'm not seeing discussed. One, I can sum up in two words, and then we can talk more about it later, which is bad faith. Liberal democracy depends upon people functioning basically in good faith. We're not naive. We know that, politicians don't always operate in good faith. But fundamentally, they have to basically operate in good faith. It's the social contract. We depend on that for the whole thing to hang together. And what we are confronted with now is a phenomenon where somebody brazenly operated in bad faith. He practically admitted that he was operating in bad faith, and the GOP backed him up, and what we have now is a political system that seems to be operating in bad faith. That seems to me unprecedented, and I don't know what we do about it, but I think it's very important that we talk about it and try to come to grips with it. That's point one. But then most of what I want to talk about in my opening remarks is the ways in which some of this is precedented. We're hearing a lot about how nothing like this has ever happened before, and again, clearly, in many important ways, that is true, including the one I just outlined, which is I think, a real game changer. But there are ways in which America has confronted this problem before, survived it only just. This is not going to be an entirely optimistic talk. Some of the points I'm going to make end in war. But it is, I think, important to take an historical view in order to understand what comes next, to not just see this. We're hearing a lot about bubbles as well, but to not view this in a chronological bubble, to not view it in an historical bubble, but to try to take a long view and understand how we got here. So a couple of just key points. I'll remind you of some things that you all know, and then a couple of things that maybe are less familiar. First of all, there are two Americas. There have always been two Americas, and we have never successfully reconciled them. Point one. And to put it in simplistic terms, because I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to do a whistle-stop tour of American history in 5 minutes. I have to put it in simplistic terms. But basically, you can think of it as the theocratic America, the United States, that was founded in 1620, with the whole story about the Plymouth colony. And that's a fact that is fundamentally, and I use the word fundamentally advisedly, a theocratic view of what American society should be, the Puritan work ethic, and that notion never went away. That created all kinds of cultures and all kinds of legal and political systems and historical events. And then overlaid on top of that, 150 years later, was a different American system, which was the Enlightenment, liberal democracy, continental philosophy view of the founding fathers, so-called, the Declaration, the Constitution. And those are fundamentally, in many ways, competing Genesis myths. They don't reconcile easily. They don't mesh well. And those two cultures have really never reconciled. The Civil War was an eruption of course it was about race and it was about economics. Those are always going to be pressure points in America. But it was also about the fact that these two fundamentally different worldviews have never really come together. And we've heard a lot in this election about the word nativism. And we've heard a lot about it on this side of the Atlantic, too. It seems to be being recuperated as a word that people think is a kind of polite face for xenophobia and racism. It somehow suggests that it's a kind of neutral term. Well, it's not a neutral term at all. It's American. It comes from the 1850s and the run-up to the American Civil War. And it was a word used to talk about the specifically anti-immigration policies of a wing of the Republican Party. And this was actually right when the Republican Party was just being invented, right? The Republican Party was new, the party of Lincoln. And they were also known as the Know-Nothings, and I'll come back to them at the end. The nativists were responding in the early 1850s to a wave of immigration that came after 1848, after the revolutions in Europe of 1848 and in the wake of the potato famine. So there was a huge influx of Germans, Italians, and Irish. And nativism was a word that was coined by people to try to keep those people out of America and to keep them out of the American political system. In particular, they were troped in terms of Catholicism, which suggests they didn't understand a lot about Germany, but we can let that go by the by. The point is that it was when you look at the conversation about nativism in the 1850s in America, it was troped in ways that are very, very parallel with the ways that now people are talking about Muslim immigration and they're talking about Mexican immigration. Then they were talking about continental European immigration, but it wasn't troped as Europeans, it was troped as Catholics. And there was a great worry expressed that this would undermine the roots of American democracy because it would become a papist conspiracy. We'd have a papist conspiracy and the Pope would be telling Americans what to do. I'm going to come back to that point at the end of my talk because Abraham Lincoln was asked whether he was a nativist, using the other name for it, the Know-Nothing. And I want to finish on a quotation from Lincoln that seems to me worth thinking about. But then we have a civil war within 10 years after that because those divisions were fomenting and they were and the cracks were deepening. And it erupted into an actual civil war. And of course, I should have said, not to brush over the first Civil War, because in my view, the U.S. Civil War was actually our second Civil War. The first Civil War was the Revolution. Because, of course, there were Americans who fought for America to stay with Britain. It was a civil war as well as a revolution. And then we had the Enlightenment, liberal, tradition created by the Founding Fathers. And then another Civil War. In the 1860s, came through the 1850s. That, of course, was fought primarily over slavery. But again, that was the catalyst, that was the spark. But there were all of these other divisions that were not reconciled. And out of that, what happens? Well, one of the things that happens is the KKK. And the KKK starts to emerge to define itself in relation to all of this. And then various things happened, including a world war, which meant that we didn't have another war ourselves. I think we got but it is one of the reasons why it took us so long, in my view, to enter both world wars in the 20th century was because, again, America has never operated very well as a collective. There was a lot of internal division about whether to join those wars. And then I want to talk about the 1920s in a little bit more detail, and then I'll finish with Lincoln, because I think the 20s are really, really instructive. The 1920s was the only decade in America, and actually some of Trump's supporters have been talking about the last time that we saw 3 Republican presidents was in the 1920s. We had Warren G. Harding, we had Calvin Coolidge, and we had Herbert Hoover. And they were 1920, 1924, 1928. It's a completely Republican decade. It was very friendly to big business. So friendly that Harding presided over the worst corruption scandal in American history when his Secretary of the Interior decided that he could lease oil reserves to friends. And it was a huge corruption scandal. It brought down Harding's presidency. We can make of that what you will. Corruption may have something to teach us here. And half the cabinet ended up in jail. Harding had a heart attack. And then his Vice President Coolidge took over. Coolidge famously said in 1925, the business of the American people is business. And the 1920s became one of the decades in American life where the cult of business really took over. People worshipped it, almost literally. There was one of the best-selling nonfiction books of 1925 and 1926, which is the same year as The Great Gatsby was published and mostly ignored. And I mention that because Gatsby was an indictment of the idea that Jay Gatsby must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. Fitzgerald is talking about the linking of worship and business, the idea that business is a religion in America. At the same time, that guy called Bruce Barton wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows, which was the biggest nonfiction bestseller of 1925 and 1926, in which it said that Jesus was the first great executive. And it was a huge hit. It's a huge hit. He was a national advertiser. Jesus would have been the CEO of America. And that's basically what this guy said, and people loved it. And you can't underestimate, we're hearing a lot from individual and exit polls, from individuals who voted for Trump, and they said this in the campaign, and they said it in the exit polls, and they believe it, that they want a businessman running the country. Now, and they don't seem to be bothered by the fact that, in my view, he's a failed businessman. That doesn't seem to trouble them. They want a businessman running things. And then, of course, what happened was these businessmen who became president were so friendly to business that they deregulated everything, and they created the conditions for the stock market boom. But it's important to bear in mind that the stock market boom of the 1920s left more than 50% of Americans living below poverty level. They were below subsistence level. We talk about it as a boom, but guess what? It was a boom that only went to the top. And then we all know what happened in 1929, and you don't need me to revisit that. But the point here is that this idea that business is something that should be worshipped, that it is the proper business of the American people, is something that, in my view, cannot be underestimated and yet consistently is underestimated. I think it's incredibly important. And then I'll just finish. There are lots of other things, obviously, to say about business and how it works here. And also, if there's time later, if anybody's interested, it's worth reviewing very quickly the history of the phrase American dream itself, which was actually coined in 1931 during the Depression in order to talk about all of the things that America had forgotten in its chasing of money. The phrase American dream was used to talk about our higher ideals, our higher aspirations. It was precisely to talk about everything except money, and now it has been co-opted into a way of talking about material dreams. And it's important, I think, to take that into account. But I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find my my Lincoln quote. Oh, here it is. So Lincoln in the 18th, I should have written down the date. Why don't I have the date? Anyway, it's the early 1850s. And he was asked if he was a know-nothing, which is to say nativist, this anti-immigrant wing. And here's what he said, and I'll leave my opening remarks here. This was in a letter. He said, "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain." And they were called know-nothings. That may sound like Trump supporters. They weren't making jokes about them being ignorant. They were called the know-nothings because they were a kind of quasi-secret wing, and so you were supposed to say you knew nothing about them. So that's why they were called know-nothings. It wasn't a claim of ignorance. Anyway, he said, "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to that, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy.
Fantastic. We will send that to Vladimir Putin right now. Thank you very much, Sarah. Pepper, what should we expect from this presidency?
So, yeah, I'm not going to talk about the past. I'm going to talk about what we know, what we might expect about the future. It's not what we know, but what we might predict from the future. And so the point I want to make is that the way to think about the Trump presidency, which I think will have a lot of purchase going forward, is to think about him as a populist. And I don't mean that in the way that the Wall Street Journal or the Economist talk about populism, which is to say this is a really simple-minded policy to a complex problem that we don't like. Populism is a particular leadership style. I was reading for a class a couple of weeks ago about populism in Latin America, and I was struck by the resonance with the way that Trump has run his very brilliant campaign. And I think we need to think about it as his governing style going forward, because I think his campaign style, as Bill hinted earlier, is going to be his governing style, and it's very important to think about. And the thing I want you to keep in mind is that Trump will have two jobs for the next 4 years. On the one hand, he will be the self-considered CEO of the United States of America. And on the other hand, he will be at the head of a new social movement who has had a changing cast of characters, but which has been very effective at mobilizing especially angry, white, working-class Americans. And so he takes both roles very seriously. He certainly takes the second one seriously. And so it won't fall away as he moves into the Oval Office. So the first point I want to make, I've got 5 minutes, I want to make 5 points. Donald Trump will not moderate his rhetoric, at least not consistently. His manner of speaking and his deft use of Twitter, that's going to continue. He's going to be tweeting from the Oval Office or the Lincoln bedroom, wherever it is he sleeps, except when he goes to New York on the weekend. Because that's a really effective way of getting his message across, right? And exactly as Bill said, he doesn't intend to use the mainstream media. The reporters may enjoy talking to him now, but they better enjoy it, because he's just going to stop doing it, because he's going straight over their heads to the American people. He's been very good at that, and he sees no reason to stop doing that. He has been a master of communication, and we're still catching up with understanding the way that he's done it. So you can expect that he'll do it. That he'll do a lot of unconventional things for an American president. And just like we complained about the tax returns were never released, they'll complain, Mr. President, it's been 114 days since you've actually had a press conference. And he said, why do I need a press conference? I tweet. You all can find out what I need to know. I don't need your hostile questions. So that is point number one to understand, that Trump's manner of communicating is not going to be through the media. It's going to be unfiltered, direct. And so the media will just have to live with that. Point two, Stephen Bannon is an important appointment. Some of you will know that so the Washington establishment, who got comprehensively whooped, as we say in the United States, in this election, they are, wringing their hands about who are the experts, we the experts who are now going to govern for Trump. Who are they going to be? So looking at all these appointments. But the key appointments are the first two, right? Which is to say, you have the chief of staff, Reince Priebus, who is an establishment person who has a good connection to Trump, who's the head of the RNC. He's now going to be chief of staff. That's not interesting, right? He's serving a very conventional role. Stephen Bannon is interesting, right? He's serving right at the heart of the White House as chief strategist, reporting not to the chief of staff, Priebus, but reporting directly to Trump. And his role, Bannon's role, is to keep, maintain, and grow the social movement that Trump built in the course of this election. And let me tell you what he said in 2014. I'm a Leninist. Lenin wanted to destroy the state, and that's my goal, too. That is Steve Bannon, former employee of Goldman Sachs, and now the right-hand communication man of the president. And he's a very important figure going forward for understanding the communication strategy of the Trump presidency as it moves into its governing phase and away from its electoral phase, which is going to be actually a permanent electoral phase. Point three, in Trump, we have a president who ran against his own party and won, and then he ran against the other party and won. And these are fundamental facts, right? Trump owes no one except his voters his victory. Now, the Republicans who are now sitting in a majority in the House and in the Senate, they owe him, but he doesn't owe them anything. They know it, and he knows it, right? And so he doesn't need to sort of shore up the Republicans, et cetera. He's shoring up brand Trump qua political brand. And this is the sense in which, looking back to Latin American populism in the heyday of Juan Perón, that's what we can understand. This is not a man who wants to rebuild the Republican Party. This is a man who wants to build a social movement that will keep him in power, right? And that's, it's a very natural political urge. But it's unconventional because most politicians came through a party. Trump did not come through the party. He used the party. Some people talked about the language of a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. Many of the Republican elite, they sort of look at him in disdain. But you know what? His voters, they hate Hillary Clinton, and they hate elites like Hillary Clinton. But they don't like Mitch McConnell, right, who's the majority leader in the Senate either. They don't like the Republican elites. They don't like the Democratic elites. Trump knows that. And so this is going to be an anti-elite presidency run from Washington or Trump Tower. It's going to be very interesting. But you should keep that in mind because it's absolutely fundamental to understanding the sort of governance that we're going to get. Now, here's an irony. So the social movement that Trump led was extremely pro-American, and that if you're going to be pro-American, you've got to be anti-something, and so this is the anti-other. And this was largely anti-Mexican, anti-trade, anti-China, anti-outsider, pro-Russia, but mostly anti-outsider. And so despite the fact that this was geared as an American nativist campaign, it was really against Americans. It was against the American elite, right? It was the American elites that Theresa May called the citizens of nowhere because they're citizens of everywhere, right? Who were the target of Trump, and they're the targets of Trump voters. And you know what? There are groups like that in the United Kingdom, in France, in the Netherlands, in Italy, et cetera, across the advanced industrial countries. These are political parties with which Trump has resonance, and Steve Bannon is saying, I'm very interested in expanding the coverage of these groups and making sure that they get a fair shake from the press because the so-called radical right has not been given a fair shake by the press. And so what you're going to have here, right, I'm commenting on this politically, not in a partisan manner, but what you have is the White House is very interested that the Le Pen movement in France, the National Front, get its fair hearing, right? Geert Wilders in the Netherlands is absolutely delighted, right? He's got someone with hair as outrageous as his, right? Okay, you have Matteo Salvini, you have Beppe Grillo in Italy. They're very excited because they have the same sort of anti-elite wave that they're trying to surf and that they're hoping to surf against Renzi in the December referendum. And then, of course, we have the French presidential election coming up. There are French elites all over the place spilling glasses of Bordeaux in nervousness because they think, we thought as far as Le Pen would get was about 30% in the upcoming presidential election, but now we're worried she could win. And Le Pen thinks that too, and Bannon thinks that too, right? And so what you're going to have is an American president whose strategic director is very interested in these movements of dissent abroad. That creates an interesting dynamic for American foreign policy. It's not that we've never been involved in foreign politics before. Au contraire, we do it all the time. We used to have coups, et cetera, that we would support. But it's linking to establishment and anti-establishment politics in a very interesting way, and it's worth following because it's going to be completely different. And so the final thing I want to say is that we have this Leninist in the White House, Steve Bannon, and it's interesting because the United States is now the vanguard of the anti-elite, anti-globalization movement. Let's savor that, shall we? Because that's deeply ironic, right? The institutions of the post-war order that were largely built by and with the help of the United States are now opposed from Washington, D.C. By its own government. And so I am not someone who thinks that the Trump presidency is going to be extremely catastrophic for American democracy. I think the institutions of American democracy are pretty robust. They have their problems, so do the problems of democracy everywhere else. The institutions of the international order, right, the international so-called liberal order that governs trade, that governs finance, that governs climate change, those institutions are in very serious trouble. And I think that's a good prediction going forward. Thanks.
Very good. Dean Acheson was present at the creation, just predicted that we're present at the destruction. Let's see. Sohrab, the future of liberals and how they can win in the future.
Yeah, I thought Pepper's analysis was really astute, and I think my brief remarks will dovetail pretty well with his. But let me start by thanking Oxford for having us and having me. And I'll have a plug for my book. You have flyers for it. I get 4 pence or whatever it is from each one. The topic, as you might see from the synopsis, is directly on point with the talk, but it's not unrelated either. So I was a never Trump conservative during the campaign. In other words, I'm a Republican who fits right into the sweet spot of what used to be called the Reagan agenda or the Reagan revolution, right? So I support a broad role for the United States as the guarantor of liberal order, including acting preemptively when necessary, so on and so forth. I'm a social conservative. I'm a Roman Catholic catechumen, so I have socially conservative views on traditional marriage and the dignity of life. And I tend to prefer free markets and individual rights as against an overbearing government. So for me to support Hillary Clinton, as I did, was extremely difficult. But why did I do it? I did it because I care more about the underlying liberal structure in the United States and in the world. And by liberal, I don't mean that in a partisan liberal left or center left sense. I mean it in the sense of relatively decent politics, politics governed by truth, and politics where individual rights are honored. And in all of those sense, I thought that Trump would be potentially very dangerous to our institutions, if not catastrophic. But I'm looking forward now, and I'm trying to think, because when Trump won, I really began to think that liberal order is in some ways faltering. I think for those of us, the assumption of my remarks is that you also like liberal order. You like free markets and what they bring. You like the stability that democratic order provides all of us, and so on and so forth. You like political choice. How to preserve liberal order is the challenge of a generation now that we see a series of movements by populist parties and movements and leaders of the far right, and in some places the far left. So how do we shore up liberalism? That's the main topic of my remarks. I'll identify 4 areas, and perhaps I'll look backwards and say, here's where I think liberalism failed. And then perhaps you could draw conclusions about what that means in terms of going forward. How can liberalism reconfigure its program so it doesn't keep losing elections? So first, I think it has to do with the terror threat. I think when the state fails in its basic responsibility, the basic responsibility of Leviathan to protect you against harm, when it repeatedly fails in these catastrophic attacks, then people begin to question the order that governs them. So the Paris attacks, I think in November, was the moment I thought Trump might be the nominee. And I remember it because President Obama gave what was universally regarded as a disastrous press conference where he said, our strategy against ISIS is working. He couldn't name again for the nth time the ideology of the enemy. In other words, he would not use the word radical Islam or jihadism to say what it is that we're up against. And that opens up this vacuum into which Trump can jump in and say, it's not just a minority of Muslims who adhere to jihadism and radical Islam, it's 1.4 billion global adherents of the faith of Islam, and they should all be banned from the country. So terror, I think, is one, and it begins with liberalism finding the comfort and the confidence. Again, when I say liberal, I don't mean left-right, but liberal order, the confidence to talk about the nature of the threat and then begin to offer solutions to address it. I think the second one is slow growth, persistent slow growth. In most of the places where you have illiberal movements rising, you have 0 to no growth or very slow growth. The U.S. for the past 8 years has been averaging around 2%, when historically it's about 4%. And when you have 2% growth instead of 4% growth is when people will look at the social welfare pie and say, well, it's not expanding, and if that's the case, then I'll be damn sure that I'll get my slice of the welfare pie before the XYZ immigrant does. So we need, again, liberals of the left and of the right, responsible liberals, need to think about how to revive growth. And the answers aren't, I dare say, in the kinds of programs put forward by Mr. Corbyn here, where look at France next door. We don't want that. The third area where I think liberalism needs to readjust is to become more comfortable with democracy. Liberalism of late in the United States and in Europe has had its own undemocratic illiberal streak where liberal elites, when they feel like the democratic process produces outcomes that they're uncomfortable with, they'll just short-circuit the process. So I would put gay marriage in that department. What I say may not resonate with any of you, but with such a fundamental question about how we order the family unit in the United States, it would have been better to have been left up to popular majorities to decide as a sovereign people, as we the people, the American people. Whereas by having an unelected court of 9 people decide, you short-circuit the democratic process. And I would point out other ones where, for example, President Obama or his administration in the first term made it more difficult for nonprofit groups with words like Tea Party in their names to get the nonprofit status that they need to be able to collect donations without having to pay taxes. Probably a story that didn't play very much here in Europe. But when you do that, and it seems like it was to some degree a political decision to do that, those movements don't go away, their ideology doesn't go away, they sort of morph and come out in a different way or in a different expression that's perhaps even more alarming to liberals. And the last thing I would say about how to repair liberalism is I think liberal societies need a kind of telos, a sense of larger meaning that is more than just a set of norms that of 60, 80,000 pages of European Union regulations and antitrust laws and so forth, something to believe in. I was interviewing Cardinal Schönborn, the Austrian cardinal, and he pointed out that a lot of liberalism's greatest gifts to humanity are, in a way, runaway children of the Judeo-Christian tradition. When you have a society that doesn't have some larger aspiration and doesn't acknowledge these roots, that I think you will get identity, tribal identity becomes the much stronger force. So liberals, I think, in this age of identity need to get comfortable with articulating an identitarianism that isn't tribal, that isn't nativist in a negative way, but it's comfortable talking about issues of identity. So I'll leave it there, but those are 4 broad thoughts. It's very abstract, but I think those are 4 areas where, by looking back at the failures of liberalism in recent years, we can begin to think how the program of the liberal movement needs to be reconfigured for it to survive the age of the Trumps and the Le Pens and so forth.
Certainly, thank you very much. Your analysis certainly also makes you worried about the French presidential election in May, where since you've got, I think, at least 3, but possibly 4 of your requirements, all so far failing in France. So let's just bear that in mind. Now, I'm going to open up in a few moments, but let me start just by asking a couple of questions about the resilience of the American democratic system to this new phenomenon, the checks and balances, the way in which the Harding presidency came to an end, and so forth, and that Pepper has also mentioned. Can it be confronted? Can it be changed by a very strong individual of a Trump-Putin type, or is it?
You mean the democratic system?
Yes, the system. How do you feel about the resilience?
My view of it is that people keep talking about how young it is, but it is resilient and it has been tested. I think it's resilient in ways that are extra governmental that we need to really think about. We have very, very robust traditions of organizations that ensure that the Constitution and the laws of the land are upheld. The ACLU is one of the most important. Many of you will have seen that the ACLU received $1 million in donation on the day after Trump was elected. And they had this great, I thought great, you'll be amazed to hear that I was not a Trump supporter, so I'm going to put that right out there. The ACLU had a new homepage on its website that said, if Mr. Trump tries to fulfill these blatantly unconstitutional campaign pledges, that was all kind of small print, and then it just said, we'll see you in court. Right? but there are lots and lots of other ones. I jotted down a few of them that have been successful in just the last 10 or 15 years in holding the White House to account. And I think it's important when we talk about the future of the governmental system. It's also worth noting that on both the left and right, and I absolutely agree with Sohrab's point about talking about a liberal order that is not party political, but to talk about the foundations of our democratic system. One of the things that we've seen in America is a consolidation of power in the executive. And I think people are sometimes unaware of that because it doesn't look like the president has so much power because he can't pass Obamacare or he can't do whatever because he's got, being blocked by Congress. And we see a Congress in gridlock and really engaged in brinksmanship. But it is also true that since at least Nixon, the White House has been taking for itself, abrogating powers that are not in the Constitution, whether you're on the left or the right. And they have been giving themselves the right to create all kinds of executive orders. So Trump has these worrying powers now. He is exempt from conflict of interest laws, for example, all kinds of things. We could start to list them. But the point is that when this consolidation of executive power, when they overreached, when Bush tried to do things, like Guantanamo, okay, he managed to set up Guantanamo, but then there was a massive and long and serious pushback. And he finally, it is being dismantled. It was not allowed to stand. So there are things, like I said, I just jotted them down. The Center for Constitutional Rights and Reprieve, the Human Rights First, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. They go on and on. They're there. They're robust. They're for real. And I think that to Pepper's point about populism, I don't disagree with anything you're saying in one sense, but in another sense, it's very clear to me that Trump is not really a populist because he doesn't really care what any of them think. He's, clearly in it for himself. He sees populism as a means to an end.
And that's different from other populists. How?
Well, fine. If I concede to your, but what I mean is that the idea that he's somehow listening to the people and standing up for them is clearly, in my view anyway, clearly a fiction. But the point, and so I'm happy to hear that that's true of other populists too. It's not my area of expertise, but and I don't dispute it for a second. But my point is simply that there is going to be pushback from those people who think that they put Trump in office in order to get certain kinds of promises fulfilled, and when those promises are not fulfilled, like bringing factories back to Indiana, which isn't going to happen. Right? So is he going to do other things that will make them happy to placate them? Again, I defer to people who know more about what he's likely to do than I do. But I think there's going to be pushback on the popular level, and then there's going to be pushback at the in terms of all of these extra governmental legal systems that we have. That the courts are robust; they will test this stuff. And it may be that the legislature steps up. I mean, it's interesting to note, and this is my final point, but it's interesting to note that just in the last 24 hours, there seems to be an awful lot of infighting going on in Trump's White House already, his elect White House that hasn't even gotten there yet. It's divisive. They don't have any experience. They don't know what they're doing. Whether they can pull it together and pull this off, well, as Pepper rightly said, he has outperformed all expectations. We've all said he couldn't do it, and he's managed to do everything that we said he couldn't do. So he may well pull this together as well. But it's also possible that his White House will be so caught up in infighting that actually the legislature needs to step up, and that may start to redress some of these problems with gridlock and with the consolidation of power in the executive branch. So I don't think it's hopeless, but I think that people have to get to work. And let me just finish the final point, is that I do disagree with both Obama and Clinton when they said that now is the time to unite around Trump. I don't think that's true. I think that now is the time to unite around American democracy and I don't mean that in a sentimental, rhetorical way. I mean in the way that Sohrab was talking about. It's about trying to find a way to listen to each other again, trying to find a common ground, trying to understand what America today might mean and how we could work together for a notion of the greater good and collective interests. And that may mean uniting to oppose Trump. But it certainly means uniting around something else, but it isn't uniting around Trump. I am not going to unite around Trump.
Rasmus, how will the media, what role will the media play from now on, now that we've moved from he said, she said to you said, essentially? And how do you feel about other parts of the kind of the checks and balance and but anyway, the way in which this will be channeled?
Well, I mean, first on the checks and balances, right? I mean, I think you could say that the formal institutions of American democracy are so resilient that I think many politicians historically have found them even too resilient. Right? It's a system of government that's set up to prevent government. This is what you realize when you read the Constitution. It's largely about preventing government. And indeed, it's worked like a charm. It has largely prevented government in many situations, right? So if you read sort of political science books, it's basically been like, it's worse than you think. The next volume is called, it's even worse than you think. It's much worse than you think. It's sort of the last 10, 15 years. And of course, right now, what you have is a situation where I personally think that the formal institutions are very resilient. But I think you also have the question, and I value what your perspective might be on this, that I think there are a significant number of Americans who might be, as much as they are fond of the system of government in the U.S., maybe wondering about the long-term viability of an electoral system where you can come second, a close second, in a two-party system and end up winning the presidency, the majority in the Senate, majority in the House, and expand your control of state-level governments. I'm not saying this is illegitimate, but I think some people are questioning the electoral system in some ways, and I wonder what that means for those people who do not feel heard, if you will, moving forward. Right now, the checks and balances are primarily about the judiciary, which remains independent, and we will see how they will take on that role if indeed Mr. Trump and the Republican Party tries to push through some of the things that might be unconstitutional. But of course, beyond the formal institutions, there are informal ones. It doesn't say anywhere that the press has a formal role in safeguarding American democracy. And we've actually, as much as the freedom of the press is protected by the Constitution in the U.S. as it is in some other countries, in a way it's extraordinary that we, at least some of us, believe sincerely that private for-profit companies will privately provide the public service that we call journalism. If you had given Arthur Schultzberger of the New York Times, $100 of your pension investment in, 10 years ago and invested in the New York Times company, now you might have enough money to buy a cup of coffee, maybe a small one if you're in Oxford. It's extraordinary that we expect these institutions to do it, and indeed they do. To some extent, imperfectly, with many limitations, but they actually do, and most research suggests that people who pay attention to this stuff are better informed and more empowered, and they may not make the decisions that elites would want them to do, but they will make the decisions that they made on a more informed basis and a more empowered basis than otherwise. What will this look like going forward? I mean, I think the polarization I tried to describe in my opening remarks between newspapers, and we can think of this in an expanded sense that I would include in this digital-born news organizations like Vox and Quartz that unashamedly play to an elite audience, that will continue to cover politics in a detailed, fact-based, and informative way, provide critical commentary, and that, from my personal view as a citizen, I think is probably the best journalism we've ever had. I think it's more informative, I think it's more detailed, I think it's more timely, I think it's more humble about its own role in society than it was in the 90s. But that will reach a smaller and smaller audience of people who are unlikely to change their views. And then on the other hand, you will have television and social media that will reach very, very large audiences with a very different kind of content. And I think Pepper is exactly right that Mr. Trump has shown in this campaign, whether through fine intelligence or natural talent, I will leave for the audience to decide, that he can play those media like an instrument with a virtuosity that we haven't seen in American politics in a very long time. And he will largely circumvent the kinds of media that many other in American politics have been much more concerned with, the elite-oriented press. And I think that will leave us in a situation in which, again, to return to the point I made, as important as I personally think media are in many other ways, in terms of the political situation we are in and the implications for the international order in particular, I very much share your analysis. This is probably the much bigger deal. I think the real question now, in a way, is much more about what the Democratic Party makes of a situation in which they have lost a winnable election, an imminently winnable election, that, in my view, were decided by two factors. One that the Democratic Party can take on, and one that I think the Democratic Party is unlikely to take on. The one that they can try to take on is the great stagnation, that for a very large part of the American population, median income and quality of life has not improved for a very long time. And this is to your point, that there is no growth, and that sharpens the conflict over resources. And the other one is identity politics, for crudely put, white, male, heterosexual, culturally Christians who have historically been privileged and are still privileged in many ways, but feel relatively less privileged than they've been historically and have reacted against that. And I think we have mounting evidence that this has been a decisive factor in the vote. And the Democratic Party has a real issue in terms of how it confronts the fact that the people who voted for Donald Trump are neither stupid nor evil, whatever you may think of them personally. Maybe some of them are, but the vast majority of them are not. They saw Donald Trump in all his glory, and they decided, that's my man.
He was better than the alternative, absolutely.
We need to talk about the alternative.
Well, we may do in a moment. Sohrab, you wanted to come in. You represent the newspaper of American business.
A working hack. Look, I think that 2 points about the media, but also the broader position that I think people who didn't like Trump should take, which is, the first point is, he should be allowed a chance to govern. I think if the media, whether it's the kind of prestige press of newspapers and so forth, or the new media online, takes the position that we are now out to derail and want to see this presidency collapse. I think that's bad for the country. First of all, because we still want government. And second of all, I think that it would only heighten these tensions. I think the media will do its job just as it should, as always have, which is dig the facts. I do think both sides need to have a fair hearing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have a worldview at all, or you can have moral equivalence, but it should be the old-style American model of asking the other side a question and framing things in an objective way, I think, is critical. The second point that I would make is that I do want, not just because I work for one, but I do think a press that's privately run is better, and I want all of the outlets that we have, whether it's, and I'll use a UK example, but the high-minded Guardian literary pages and The Sun and The Star, all of these have to be able to compete and do what they do. I worry about a sort of state press that hands down a line that folks on this panel might agree with or whatever, but the other points of view, it's not like if they don't get an airing, they go away. So I think I disagree. I think with my friend about the value of a privately run free enterprise press.
Sorry, can I just say, I meant in no way to question the value of a privately run period. I think that's critical for democracy in many ways. I also think it's valuable, but I don't think it's particularly important in terms of influencing the core of a Trump administration for the reasons outlined by Pepper, in terms of how I think he will govern, and for the reasons I tried to outline in terms of how I think the people who voted for him found information in many, many other respects. I think it's absolutely critical, and certainly to not only have public service media as though they may play a role, but absolutely.
Now, finally, I mean, just to keep with this Berlusconi analogy, because he was the permanent campaigner and so forth, there were, I would say, several important things about Berlusconi, but one of them was that he was consistently underestimated. It was consistently assumed that he would not last, and 20 years later he was still the dominant politician in Italy. Second, though, he didn't actually have a governing agenda. His interest was staying in power, protecting his own business interests and his friends. Ran government as a sultan at the center of his court, in effect, and his main proposition was, "I'll protect you from the communists," i.e., the others, and he remained popular doing that. That is not going to be the same as Trump. I mean, Trump will have an agenda, I would say. So my question, perhaps to you, Pepper, is what will delivering look like, and what would you expect to see if you follow your principles, that he's going to be the permanent campaigner, that you've got this anti-elite proposition, it's a social movement. How do you deliver in order to maintain that?
So it's a great question. I think it's the big question we should ask ourselves. And the meta expectation going forward is that panels like these and newspaper leaders that you read are consistently going to be wrong on a higher percentage of the time going forward with Trump as we figure out the new normal. Because there are a bunch of parameters that have changed, and we're still trying to figure out what those parameters are. I think. To answer your question, the response that Trump has to deliver to his social movement is he has to deliver more nastiness on immigration, and he has to deliver something on trade. That's what he said he was going to do. And I think he will do it. What exactly it will be, I don't think it will be tearing down trade with China. I think it will be strategically picking out China and labeling it a currency manipulator, but who cares? But NAFTA could be done for. And so the North American Free Trade Agreement, which bore a lot of the brunt of Trump's attacks in the election, that's something you have to look out for, because he's got to say, I've got to deliver to the people to whom I promised, and that's something he's going to be thinking about. So what that means is you're going to round up a lot of people who've come to the United States illegally and who are living normal lives, and bad things are going to happen to them. And a sort of a side event related to this is that there's been more violence against immigrants in the United States, and that's part of the anti-immigrant moment, which is not to say that it's illegitimate for Trump to have a policy about this anti-immigration. He won a democratic election using the rules of the game, right? So just to step back for a second and say, Trump won. We have an electoral college. Everyone agreed the electoral college was the rule. The electoral college is not going to change anytime soon, however much you dislike it, and he won. Everyone, admitted those were the rules. He won the rules, and so it's now his chance to govern. And so for me, this is sort of partisan politics. Is what happened. He ran, he won. He's going to govern, and his opponents are going to oppose him. That's how democracy works. It's what we do. So that's what I think he'll do. And I think that what you'll see emerge soon is he's going to. So Sarah's point is important, that it's not that he can bring back those jobs, right? But he can deliver what he views as the identity message, or what he claimed was the identity message about membership. This is to say, membership in the American citizenship has its privileges, right? And so those who are outside, I'm going to treat them differently. And you do that by being mean to illegal immigrants. And you do that by doing something about trade, which people blame for, in many cases rightly, for having lost their jobs. But it's not that eliminating NAFTA will bring back those jobs. And so I think he'll do that. And then I think that he will try to balance between spending a lot of money on infrastructure and bringing some Democrats along, and doing some Republican tax cuts and bringing some Republicans along. But he will stay in constant tension with both those party caucuses, and he'll stay focused on his group.
But for his movement, I mean, I assume, and but tell me if I'm wrong, that both trade and those infrastructure and tax thing matter because they're means to an end, which is rising incomes for the sort of people who voted for him because they're frustrated about low growth in median incomes, about lack of hope and so forth. Or is that not right?
I don't think we have a good sense of to what extent it's that. I mean, if you wipe out a bunch of free trade agreements and nothing happens and the situation doesn't get better, you realize, oh my gosh, well, this is deindustrialization and the world has changed, and maybe that simple solution wasn't the right one. But it takes a little time. There is an identity portion, however, to this claim of the American white working class. That is, and I say the American white working class because the American black working class has very different voting preferences and is viewed very differently by the white working class, which wants to be different from it and generally votes in a different way than it does. And so Trump will respond to these emotional identity cues, and he will deliver some trade agreements. And if he does that, then he's doing more than they think, those voters think the Democrats ever did for them. So what the Democrats said is, our tax policy is better for you. Our health care policy is better for you. But they didn't speak in any meaningful way, in a way that could resonate to the identity concerns of these people and the challenges they've had, that their jobs have been devalued. And so that's the problem for the Democrats going forward. That's a problem for the Democrats.
That's a quick point on this from Sarah, and then I'll open up.
Very quickly, I just think that we have to add one other demographic to a conversation about identity here, because we're overwhelmingly talking about older voters, overwhelmingly. And so there are two things that we need to think about. One is the 47% of the country who didn't vote at all. And the other is the fact that the millennial electoral map, which I'm sure many of you have seen, was an overwhelming sweep for the Democrats. It was 41 states, and Clinton carried 504 electoral votes for 23 to Trump among young people aged 18 to 25. So what we're describing is a phenomenon that brought Trump into power. It may well not keep him in power at all, in my view. And I think we have to be thinking about that as well. We also do have to be talking and thinking about the fact that we're talking about the defeat of the first female candidate. I will not allow that not to be spoken of. It's too important.
Those young people that will grow up and pay taxes.
Sure they will.
That's it. We all used to vote left.
Yeah,
That's right.
Some of us still do.
So let's get some 3 or 4 contributions from the floor. You had your hand up. I think we can have Jonathan afterwards.
Hi, Salman from BSG. I have to say, our first week here, there was a panel to discuss trade. And are there winners and losers? And Professor Culpepper, you were very early on, before the reality of Trump hit, aware of how deep this issue resonated in the American political voters' mind. And that's one of the first things I remember after the election. But I have 2 questions that are not unrelated. The first, everything has been unconventional so far. Is there a not legitimate, but is there a realistic probability of impeachment during Trump's first term for various reasons? That's one. 2, are we exaggerating the Trump phenomenon? One poll which put Barack Obama against Trump gave Barack Obama 55 or 56% to Trump's 42 or 43%. Is it an issue of Trump tapping into something that's huge, or is it simply the fact that there was a very, very highly unliked candidate on the other side?
51. Yeah, exactly. Essentially. Jonathan.
I guess my question, and it's kind of been danced around by Pepper and Rasmus, has been kind of the future of the Democratic Party. And we're seeing some real cleavages take shape now. Rep. Keith Ellison, who's a Muslim American from Minnesota, is just announced he's running for DNC chair. Former DNC chair Howard Dean has now gotten in the race. There's a handful of other candidates who are thinking about getting in this race. And I guess my question really is about how does the DNC and the Democratic Party begin to piece itself back together, and how does it define itself in light of Trump in terms of building up a ground game and its prospects for either 2018 or 2020 in terms of a standard bearer?
Okay, thank you. A couple more at the back there, and then in the middle, maybe.
Hello, Fadi Salim. I'm a DPhil student here at BSG. So does it matter, and my question to Mr. Neilsen and to Pepper, does it matter if Trump delivers on the promises or not that he made to his voters come next 4 years, given that he's able to manipulate the media, given that perception maybe matter more than truth and facts? And if come next 4 years, there's another Syria or another scary factor that can energize people. And I'm asking this question in light of the fact that according to different research on social media, for example, highlighting the fact that there are numerous, or at least 4 times as much as computational programs supporting bots, if you like, supporting or disseminating this kind of information that is captured by the mainstream media and put in the mainstream media. So does it matter really if the perception even of such a factor at the end more important than the actual delivery of that Trump does?
Okay, and we had one. Oh, actually, we'll come to a lady in the front here, and then I'll come to you after in the next round. Actually, yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Yeah, to Sarah Churchwell, you said that this time America had a possibility to elect a female president. Why so did women not support Hillary Clinton but Trump?
Okay, let's start with that, I'd say, and then we'll move on to the prospects of the Democratic Party and the others. Sarah.
Well, first of all, let's bear in mind that some women did overwhelmingly vote for Clinton. I think 96% of African-American women voted for Clinton, and a very high proportion of Latino women voted for Clinton. I don't have the number in my head, but it was also a majority. 53% of white women voted for Trump. So what do we conclude from that? Well, I think you can only conclude a couple of obvious things. They were not put off. And I think the way that we're talking about race has been too simplistic. But because of that, we get ourselves tangled into things where we don't actually just say what we can observe here, right? So it seems to me that it is beyond doubt that what this demonstrates is that for those women, the very clear racism of his campaign was not a deal breaker. That doesn't make them actively racist, but it means that they were comfortable with racism. It means that they were okay with it. They didn't think it disqualified him from the highest office in the land. Similarly, it means that they were prepared to overlook or excuse or live with his aggressive misogyny. They were prepared to live with or overlook or excuse or deny his sexual assaults and aggression. So you get things like his daughter saying, well, my father's not a sexual harasser. I've known him my whole life. And you go, well, he didn't harass you. Good. But, that doesn't actually disprove anything. And we've seen it anecdotally, these women saying things like, no, I believe he's kind, right? Well, you seem to believe he's kind, in my view, in the teeth of all evidence to the contrary. But what we're seeing is that's one example of it's symptomatic of a larger problem that we've seen with this election and that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic, which is about confirmation bias. It's about the fact that people will not they have their worldview first, and they cherry pick the evidence to fit their worldview, and that's why I talked about bad faith, because I mean bad faith not only in the kind of practical, normal, commonsensical way of somebody who's being deceptive and two-faced, but also in the more philosophical sense of bad faith, the Sartrean notion of bad faith, which is when we won't confront facts, when we use cognitive dissonance to get around confronting things that make us uncomfortable. And that's what we saw. We saw an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance of people trying to put these two things together and find a way through it. So all I conclude is that these were women who did not feel that these issues were enough for them to disqualify him, and they voted along whatever the other lines were, economic lines. I also think...
But also negative views about Hillary Clinton.
Definitely negative views about Hillary Clinton, of course.
It's not all about Trump.
No, it's not at all. And but I think the important thing here again is that the way that sexism works, and I'm sure many people here in this room don't need me to tell them this, but just so that we're all clear about it, because I keep hearing people say, well, how can women be sexist? Well, of course women are sexist. Sexist is a value system sexism is a value system in our society, and women internalize it too. They're not exempt from it, and so they're constantly. I know anecdotally, and again saw on social media, but I spoke to women. I know women who said, well, at the end of the day, I just didn't really think she would be taken seriously by foreign powers. I just didn't think she was a strong enough leader. I just didn't think they would take a woman seriously. Women said this. It's anecdotal, but they said it. So the sense that they themselves don't see, in Trump's whole dog whistle misogyny of, I don't know, fellas, she just doesn't appear presidential, does she? Gee, I wonder what it is about her appearance that doesn't seem presidential to you. So all of these ways in which the idea of a woman leader was being constantly undermined is also something that women themselves have been raised not to trust the ability of a woman to either lead or to be taken seriously. So all of those factors have to be taken into account. She was operating within a sexist system, and was not able to overcome that. It was not by any means the only factor, but it was a very large one, and it troubles me that we're so quickly ready to move past it, because if Obama had lost his two campaigns, nobody would be saying that racism wasn't a factor.
Right. Sohrab.
I'll just say one more. The reactionary in me is really coming out now. I will say, though, I'm willing to grant a lot of that, but also add that in an age of pitchforks and populism, the Democrats chose to put forward a latter-day Marie Antoinette, okay? What she did with her emails, I will say, was unlawful. Okay, the FBI didn't conclude that, but I've spoken with and heard of so many members of our military that if they had done a tenth of what that she had done, they would be in prison already, or they'd be plea bargaining or whatever. It'd be a criminal trial. So there is that issue too. I mean, she was just deeply, deeply flawed, and her campaign message was just about herself. Right? It was like, I'm with her. In an age where people are hungry for a message, she just put forward her own self. So she was
okay.
Together, but that's a
yeah.
Okay, on to the future. The Democratic Party, how do they regain ground in 2018?
So I first want to respond to the impeachment question. I don't think so. I think that there are plenty of grounds that one can object to Trump's business practices, but I don't know that he hasn't assumed the office of presidency, so I don't think he's done anything to be impeached yet. And so we'll see. It could happen, but it depends on what you do. So no, I don't think so. I don't think that's remotely a realistic possibility. I do think the question about Obama. Obama the candidate. Obama's an extraordinary candidate, and it was a close election. And so Hillary was a poor choice of candidate in an anti-elite year. That is certainly true. And the Democrats didn't have a lot of alternatives, right? There wasn't a sort of thick bench of Democrats fighting against Hillary Clinton. And Democrats have a lot of time to think about that, which allows me to pivot to the question about, so what do the Democrats do now? So the Democrats, they need young talent to carry this forward. I mean, you can talk about Elizabeth Warren, you can talk about Cory Booker, and these are very talented politicians. But it's not that the Democrats have, 10 people at state house level around the country where we can say these are the coming men and women of the Democratic Party. It's been a poor sort of succession strategy in the Democratic Party. And so let's view this, if you're a Democrat, which you are, as a time of, opportunity and renewal. Because what's going to happen is the party is going to say, we screwed up, and so let's think about what the problem was. And so you can have one analysis of the problem, which I think is misguided, and that is, this country is demographically changing, and so therefore we can ignore the white working class. They got us this time, but next time we'll get them, and then henceforth forevermore. And I think that is just crazy. That is not going to happen in any foreseeable future. There are a lot of white people, and they're white working class voters, and you've got to have some of them on board. You don't have to have all of them, and it doesn't have to be about race all the time, but you've got to have some of those voters. And for the Democratic Party to have ignored them in this election was very, very costly. And it will continue to be costly. And I think that, so part of the message of revisiting what the Democrats do now is, how do we rethink this? What do we do? Do we flesh out our identity politics message where we've been very strong? Or do we actually go where we're weak and say, why did those people in Michigan vote against us? Why did those people in Pennsylvania go? Let's go talk to them. I mean, JP, I think we had a great ground game, the Democratic Party. And the ground game didn't do squat, because you can't get out voters who are not excited about your candidate. And so you get voters excited about your candidate by a candidate that they view as likely to change their lives. And so for any number of reasons, they didn't think this was the candidate, and they didn't turn out, despite the fact that there were iPads going around saying, oh, we think you're very likely to vote given that you're a very young voter. Would you please come vote? No, I'm going to go drink my latte because I just don't care. And so you've got to turn out your voters, and so there's going to be an important debate about that. And the Republicans, by the way, need to have the same debate. Because this is a very unconventional coalition that Trump has put together. And so Trump is not planning to institutionalize it, as I said, because Trump is about Trump, right? And so the Republican Party needs to think hard about what is the shape of our future coalition, which way are we going to move? Are we going to sort of tap into the white working class in a way that we haven't before, and maybe add some to our policy piece such that we can have part of an enduring coalition? So it's a very exciting time politically to watch the sort of bubbling that's happening underneath, because there will be change.
I'm going to come back to to the delivery matters question at the end, and particularly get Rasmus to talk about that. But I'm going to take one more round of questions.
If I may just quickly on the question of the party and the question of the back, which we didn't address. I mean, I think just one thing that's important to keep in mind, and people who are here from the UK will recognize this, whether you are Conservative sympathisers during the years in the wilderness when Blair was in government, or whether you are perhaps Labour sympathisers in the current situation. that it's important to remember there is no such thing as a Democratic Party, unless by that one means a group of people who disagree about how to capture power. So there is no center in which rational evidence-based decisions are made on the strategy next time. There is a group of people who would all like to lead, and they will sort of fight out how to do that, but that is in part about inter-party competition and not about making a sort of a coherent strategic set of decisions. The only point in time in which there is a center is when it's least needed, right? It's in sort of the second half of the first term of a president seeking re-election, George W. Bush or Barack Obama. Now, it's a free-for-all. In terms of the question from the back about this looking forward, and if this is sort of reiterating some of the points made by Pepper at the tail end of our opening remarks, is I think there are two issues here, right? What do people want? I think people want two things. They want redistribution and they want recognition. Can Donald Trump deliver redistribution if you are in Gary, Indiana, the steel plant closed, maybe your T-shirts are cheaper? No, he can't bring back the steel plant. He can maybe do some things, and I think he will try. But what he can do is that he can recognize. He can show that he really cares. And he will. And he will show that. And if he comes up against an alternative candidate in 2020 who will talk only about redistribution, trade deals, making your T-shirts even cheaper, and maybe creating more white-collar professional jobs on the coasts, it's not going to play very well in Gary, Indiana. Recognition, if it's another sort of East Coast, well-educated liberal moving in wealthy circles, giving talks to Goldman Sachs, it's going to be a tough one, the recognition one. Donald Trump pulled that off as a billionaire real estate developer from New York, serial divorcee, and so on and so forth. But people voted for him in part because they believe that he cares. He gets it. And that is, I think, the central challenge for the Democratic Party. Barack Obama got the new generation that, as Sarah rightly said, also voted for Hillary Clinton. And that worked for him. But Hillary Clinton didn't get the old base for the Democratic Party well enough, and she didn't get the Barack Obama coalition well enough either. So she sort of fell between two chairs. And as several people have said, let's remember it wasn't a landslide. It was an upset result, a surprising result, but it wasn't a landslide.
Of course, she won the popular vote.
She won the popular vote, but as Pepper rightly said, she lost by the rules of the game, and that's a fact. But she won the popular vote.
But the big change was the loss of Democratic votes, not the rise of Donald Trump.
Yeah, Donald Trump got fewer votes than Mitt Romney, I think we can say now.
Exactly.
But she got.
We've got very short amount of time left, so we're going to move to a gentleman in the middle.
Thanks very much.
Brisk questions.
I'll try and be quick. So it's been a bit domestic at the moment, so I kind of want to go a bit further afield. I believe it was Pepper that had said, a lot of the implications might not actually be domestic, but a bit further abroad. And I, even outside of Europe and Russia, I know that Obama had worked on his pivot to Asia a lot, and I'm curious, with sort of a protectionist policy from Trump in the pipeline, how do policies containing or working with a growing China and Xi Jinping in China with a lot of growing aspirations, how could that avenue be impacted with Trump in the White House?
Okay, lady in the front. Then I'll come over here.
Thank you all for speaking. I'm listening to each of you speak, and in particular, I'm really grateful that there's an American conservative here, because I've been having this conversation with a lot of other more democratic, on the democratic side, Americans and everyone abroad, and we're all in violent agreement. It's very easy to find a lot of things wrong with Trump and have conversations about using the checks and balances system in order to monitor and control decisions and outcomes going forward. But for me, what underpins all of this is how much we don't understand about psychologically what's happening with not just the American public, but as we see this trend going more broadly, what's happening in the world in general. I'm really curious in particular about your thoughts about how well we've assessed what's happening, what's playing out psychologically with with the 60 million Americans that voted for Trump. Do we really know these people, and what do you think the next steps are with understanding this movement in particular? Thank you.
Okay, a gentleman here, and then we'll go to the back.
Yes, continuing on from the previous questioner, what are any implications or lessons for the UK?
Okay. Back, Sarah.
So you've seen the media and the civil society respond and react very strongly, so much so that Donald Trump has been tweeting against the New York Times as president-elect. So do you think that the media or the civil society will have any impact or be able to restrain him in the next 4 years?
Okay, one more last question. I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, so I'll have to stop here.
Another question about the foreign policy implications of Trump's victory. After his victory, there have been a lot of references about the end of history, which is what you sort of refer to as sort of this post-war liberal order that the United States actually worked so hard to build over the past few decades. So how Trump, as a pragmatic businessman, how is going to reconcile having to deliver on his promise of protectionism, bringing factories back to Indiana, and with the actual need for maintaining an open trade and investment regime that has benefited American corporations like Apple, Boeing, Facebook, and Google?
Okay, that's a mystery that it'll be hard to, but I would just emphasize, not as a historian, that he's not the first protectionist American president, even since 1945. Depends, there's a matter of degree in these things. What should we go to? Pepper, in terms of what do we need to know about the 60 million to understand this more than we already do? Or is that the important question?
Well, I know lots about them because many of them are in my extended family. And so they were going to vote Republican anyway, and they became very comfortable with the fact that, they were voting for the candidate who was not Hillary Clinton. And so it's the swing voters who actually got put, and so the extended family I'm talking about is not in the swing voting category. It's the swing voters we need to know more about. That's a much smaller slice of the population. And they, as you say, represent a strong anti-elite movement that is going on around the advanced industrial countries against the settlement that they view as not being fair to them. And the leaders who come in with great policies made in schools like these, saying they're going to make their lives a little bit better, they don't get it. That they don't get that their lives have actually been made any better. And Trump speaks that language. And he speaks and he says, you know what, those people would have tried to screw me too, but I've got $1 billion, I think, because we never told us how much he had, but I've got $1 billion, and so I can go ahead and roll over them. And that resonated. And so what you're going to see is that politicians who can attack the elite until the elite come up with solutions and ways of selling their solutions that are perceived as credible and resonate, you're going to get the same thing happening in country after another.
Now, Sarah, you wrote a piece in the FT on June the 24th, which said, fellow Americans, don't make the British blunder. Mm-hmm. So is this now a piece saying, fellow Britons, don't make the American blunder? Yeah. No, what's the impact on the UK at all? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an impact on. I mean, it's exactly to Sohrab's point about the liberal order, right? The Western liberal order, and a lot will depend on what happens in France in May, obviously. Because part of what happens to Britain is dependent on what happens in the EU. I mean, Brexit may or may not mean Brexit, not that we know what that means, but if the EU really unravels, then yes, there will be very grave consequences in terms of actually. I mean, one of the things that worries me the most in terms of these kinds of populist rises is that Trump's as I said, bad faith, his deeply, deeply corrupt tactics were successful. That's really worrying. I think that has very grave consequences. I've talked to people who worked on the Brexit campaign who said, they were putting things on the pamphlet, and we would say, but, that's not actually true, like the thing they would say about where the immigrants were, and you would say, well, actually, they're not there. And they would go, yeah, but then we won't win. So we're in a position now in all kinds of areas of Western society where people are putting party and self-interest before any notion of a greater good, of a national interest. And I think there are a couple of very small things that we can do in terms of the implications for the UK, and I'm actually going to try to write a piece to call for this. I think one of the really basic things we have to do, we have to start teaching citizenship again. In the schools, we have to make sure that we have a citizenry that at least has basic legal literacy, has basic political literacy, understands the difference between referendums and first past the post, and so we don't have a spike in people Googling what is the EU after the referendum. which literally happened, right? So I think there are simple things like that we can do to go back to basics and to say this stuff doesn't transmit itself. We have an obligation, and that's what I mean by shoring up the foundations. And that is not party political. So you can draw your own conclusions about who you vote for, but I want you to be voting in an informed way and understanding how the process works.
So closing remark, Sohrab, or any of these questions, but also just if you want to end on a spirited telos type.
No, I will say, who are the 60 million? Look, I know, obviously I know a lot of Trump supporters, but I would say the one that stuck with me is not a white working class person. He's an Italian-American immigrant in Boston who owns a restaurant. And his friend, who's also a friend of mine, who has essentially a regional car parts manufacturing business. And the reason they were sympathetic to Trump is that they wanted to grow their businesses. And they felt like if they grew their businesses, they would run up against regulation, they would run up against a really overbearing progressive state. And they felt like, let me just put it bluntly, they felt like over the past 8 years, the left had pushed too hard. And now it was time to push a little back. Didn't matter who it was, and they all are smart enough or extremely successful to realize the flaws of Trump, but nevertheless, and this is the one feeling where I sort of, even though, like I said, I voted for Hillary, I endorsed her in a column, but I feel that the left has gone too far, and there's a time for a pushing back. And the restaurateur, who's Italian-American, made a bet with me that I would eat a shoe, that he could make a shoe if if Trump won, like he would actually make a dish out of it. So when I go back to Boston, which is my hometown, my digestive system will be in trouble. So
Splendid. Well, I'm going to bring it to a close. I will just say we haven't had time to talk about the international implications, but I will just interject that Prime Minister Abe of Japan is going to go and visit President Trump tomorrow. President-elect Trump.
Thank you.
And that is an important point because it is very unusual for another foreign leader to meet a president-elect rather than waiting until he's got a team in place and all of that. Why is he doing that? He's worried about China. He's seeing Vladimir Putin on a state visit to Japan, an official visit to Japan rather in December. There's a lot in play as far as the situation of people is concerned. Japanese ambassador this morning at a breakfast that I was attending at the International Institute for Strategic Studies said, "You're all complacent. You should realize that the world is in a crisis." Now, I personally think that we can manage this, but it was to hear it from a Japanese ambassador was quite striking, that he saw that, and I think that's also why his prime minister is rushing to see President-elect Trump. Join with me in thanking our splendid panel. And in thanking both the Blavatnik School